Han Jae-wook was a man who ruled Seoul with a silken glove and a steel heart. They said he was untouchable, protected by high-tech sensors and a private army. But on a night meant for champagne and silence, he lay slumped against his own designer sofa, a bullet hole blooming like a red rose across his white shirt. His wife, Soo-yeon, was on her knees, her elegant gown soaked in his blood, screaming for a help that wasn't coming. Then the door opened. Lim Soo-min, the woman who had served their tea and ironed their sheets for 5 years, stepped into the light. She didn't have a medical kit. She didn't have a phone. She had a cold, black handgun aimed directly at the center of the Mafia boss's forehead. She had seen every secret. She had heard every whispered deal. She had filed every one of Jae-wook's sins away for this exact moment. This was the silver hair clip your father gave your mother before you burned their house down in Busan. Soo-min's voice was no longer soft and obedient. It was the sound of a blade clearing a scabbard. They begged for mercy. I watched from the floor. You walked out. They did not. My resume isn't written on paper. It's carved into the memories of the people you destroyed. You don't keep a maid because she's invisible. You keep her because you're too arrogant to think she has eyes. Before the sun would rise, the most fortified penthouse in the city would become a kill box. Guards, lieutenants, and cleaners, everyone Jae-wook trusted would be revealed as a stranger. Han Jae-wook had built his throne on a foundation of silence and shadow. From the docks of Busan to the glass towers of Gangnam, he was the ghost who moved the city's money. For a decade, he had outplayed every rival and bought every official, creating a golden cage to keep his wife, Soo-yeon, pure and unaware. But at 45, the architect of the city's pain realized the walls were closing in. It started with the small things. A misplaced file. A bodyguard who stopped making eye contact. Then came the night that changed everything. The night an assassin's bullet found the Iron Boss, and the woman who cleaned his floors decided it was time to collect the debt. The penthouse was filled with the warm glow of candlelight and the soft sound of slow music. It was their 5th wedding anniversary, and Han Jae-wook had spared no expense. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering lights of Seoul. He looked like a king in his tailored suit, strong and untouchable. Across the table, Soo-yeon smiled at him. She wore a navy silk gown that shimmered like the ocean. For a moment, the dangerous world of the Mafia felt 1,000 miles away. Jae-wook reached for her hand, his eyes softening. He had spent years building walls of steel and secrets just to keep her safe and happy. To us, he whispered, raising a crystal glass. The glass never touched his lips. A sudden, sharp crack shattered the peace of the room. The large window behind them exploded into 1,000 sparkling diamonds of glass. Jae-wook didn't hesitate. Before Soo-yeon could even scream, he lunged forward. He threw his body in front of hers, using himself as a human shield. A second wet thud echoed through the air. Jae-wook gasped, his body jerking back as a bullet tore into his chest. He collapsed onto the thick cream rug, his blood blooming like a dark, red flower across his white shirt. Jae-wook. Soo-yeon cried out. She dropped to her knees beside him, her dress pooling in the red stains. Her hands shook as she pressed them against his chest, trying to stop the heavy flow of blood. Her fingers were quickly stained crimson. Stay with me. Please, Jae-wook, look at me. Jae-wook's face went pale, and a thin line of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. He tried to speak, but only a ragged gasp came out. His eyes were wide, filled with shock and a strange, cold calculation. Even as his life leaked out onto the floor, he was searching the room, looking for the next threat. He was a man who lived by the sword, and he knew that an attack like this never came alone. Soo-yeon's world felt like it was falling apart. The luxury of the room now felt like a cold cage. She looked toward the door, her voice breaking as she screamed for help. Someone, anyone, help him. The heavy oak doors of the dining room swung open slowly. Soo-yeon felt a rush of relief, thinking the guards had finally arrived. But it wasn't the security team. It was Soo-min, their quiet maid who had served them for 5 years. She walked in with a calm, steady pace, her black and white uniform perfectly neat. She didn't have a medical kit, and she didn't look afraid. Sumin stopped a few feet away. With a motion so smooth it looked practiced, she reached into her white apron. She didn't pull out a cloth or a bandage. Instead, she pulled out a heavy black handgun. She raised her arm, aiming the weapon directly at Jae-wook's head. Her face was like stone. No pity, no fear. The woman who had ironed Jae-wook's shirts every morning was now standing over him like an angel of death. Soo-yeon froze, her hands still covered in her husband's blood, as she realized the true nightmare was only just beginning. Soo-yeon stared at the maid in total shock. Her hands were still wet with Jae-wook's blood, and the room was so quiet she could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Sumin, the woman who had lived in their house for 5 years, stood as still as a statue. She didn't look like a maid anymore. Her back was straight, and her eyes were cold and sharp. She looked like a hunter who had finally caught her prey. Sumin, what are you doing? Soo-yeon begged, her voice shaking. He's dying. Put the gun down and call an ambulance. The maid didn't move the gun. A small, bitter smile touched her lips. My name is not Sumin, she said. Her voice was flat and hard, like 2 stones rubbing together. And I have waited a very long time for him to be exactly where he is right now. On the floor, bleeding. Jae-wook let out a ragged cough. More blood stained his lips, but he forced his eyes to stay open. He looked at the maid, trying to remember a face from a past he had tried to bury. He had many enemies, but the way she looked at him was personal. It was a look of pure, old hatred. You don't remember me, do you, Jae-wook? She asked. She reached into her apron with her free hand and pulled out a small, silver hair clip. It was old and tarnished, but it caught the light. You saw this clip 20 years ago. It belonged to my mother. She was wearing it the night you and your men came to the Busan docks. Jae-wook's eyes widened. The docks. He remembered the smell of salt water and the sound of screaming. He remembered the fire he had started to hide the evidence of his rise to power. He had thought everyone from that night was gone. I was the little girl hiding under the floorboards, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. I watched through the cracks as you took everything from us. I watched you walk out into the night while my world burned to ash. You didn't just kill my family, Jae-wook. You created a ghost. And that ghost has been making your tea and cleaning your floors, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Soo-yeon looked at her husband in horror. The man she loved, the man she thought was a protector, was being described as a monster. She looked at his pale face, wanting him to say it was a lie, but he remained silent. His guilt was written in the way he couldn't meet the maid's eyes. I didn't pull the trigger through that window, the maid said, glancing at the shattered glass. That was someone else. Your rivals are finally moving in, but I am not going to let them have the prize. You are mine, Jae-wook. I want to be the last thing you see before the lights go out. She stepped closer, the heavy boots she wore beneath her long skirt clunking against the wood floor. The silver hair clip fell from her hand, landing in the pool of blood on the rug. The maid was gone. Only the ghost of Busan remained, and she was ready to settle the debt. The wind howled through the jagged hole in the window, making the long curtains flap like the wings of a giant bird. Soo-yeon looked at the wide, double doors of the penthouse. Usually, 2 strong guards stood there every second of the day. But the hallway was silent. There was no sound of running feet, no shouting voices, and no help coming. The fortress that was supposed to keep them safe now felt like a giant, cold tomb. The guards, Soo-yeon whispered, her eyes darting toward the door. Why haven't they come in? The maid, who now stood with the power of a queen, didn't even turn her head. Your guards are gone, Soo-yeon. Some were paid to look the other way. Others are lying in the stairwell. I made sure that tonight, this floor belongs only to us. Jae-wook let out a low, painful groan. He tried to lift his hand to reach for his phone on the table, but the maid stepped forward and crushed the device under her heavy boot. The glass screen shattered instantly. She had cut them off from the rest of the world. The high-tech cameras, the silent alarms, and the panic buttons were all useless now. The man who ruled the city was trapped in a room he had built to be unbreakable. Soo-yeon felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She realized that the maid had planned this for months, maybe years. Every secret exit had been blocked. Every backup plan had been destroyed. They were 30 floors above the street, and there was no way out. The luxury around them, the gold-trimmed mirrors and the soft silk chairs, looked like the decorations of a funeral. "You're going to let us die here?" Soo-yeon asked, her voice cracking. "I am going to let the truth come out first," the ghost of Busan replied. She didn't look at the wife with anger, but with a strange kind of pity. "You live in a house of lies, Soo-yeon. You think your husband is a hero because he buys you diamonds. But those diamonds were bought with the lives of people like my mother." Jae-wook's breathing was getting shallower. The blood on the rug was spreading further, touching the edges of the white sofa. He looked up at the ceiling, his jaw tight. He knew his security was perfect, which meant the only way it could fail was if someone he trusted had opened the door from the inside. He had trusted the woman who cleaned his house, and that mistake had turned his palace into a grave. The silence in the penthouse was heavy. Outside, the city lights continued to twinkle, and people went about their lives, not knowing that a king was falling. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of blood and old secrets. Soo-yeon held Jae-wook's hand, but for the first time, she felt like she was holding the hand of a stranger. They were alone in the dark, and the night was far from over. The maid stepped closer, the barrel of her gun steady and cold. She did not look at the blood on the floor. She only looked at Jae-wook's fading eyes. "Tell her," the ghost of Busan commanded. Her voice was like ice. "Tell your wife why I am here. Tell her about the night the docks turned red." Soo-yeon looked at her husband, her heart pounding against her ribs. She wanted him to deny it. She wanted him to say this was all a terrible mistake. "Jae-wook, please," she sobbed. "Tell her she's wrong. Tell me you didn't do those things." Jae-wook closed his eyes for a moment. He looked tired, his face the color of gray ash. When he opened his eyes again, there was no lie left in them. "I did what I had to do," he whispered. His voice was thin and raspy. "I was young and had nothing. The docks were controlled by old men who were slow and weak. To take their power, I had to remove them. All of them." He looked at the maid, a spark of painful memory finally lighting up his gaze. "Your father, he wouldn't step aside. He was a good man, but he stood in the way of the future I wanted. I didn't just want money, Soo-yeon. I wanted a world where no one could ever hurt us again. But to build that world, I had to burn the old one down." Soo-yeon pulled her hands away from his chest. The blood on her skin felt hot and heavy, like a weight she could no longer carry. "You killed families?" she asked. Her voice was a tiny, broken thing. "The money that paid for this house, the clothes I wear, it all came from that?" "I kept you in the light so I could stay in the dark," Jae-wook said, a tear finally tracking through the dust and blood on his cheek. "I thought if I loved you enough, the ghosts would stay away. I thought I could buy our way out of the past." The maid laughed, but it was a sound without any joy. "You can't buy back the life, Jae-wook. You can't buy back the 20 years I spent eating bitterness while you ate off gold plates." She turned her gaze to Soo-yeon. He didn't just kill them. He watched. He made sure the fires were high enough so that no one could escape. He didn't just take the docks. He took the souls of everyone who lived there. The luxury of the penthouse seemed to vanish. The expensive paintings and the soft music felt like a lie. Soo-yeon looked around the room and saw only the shadows of the people Jae-wook had stepped on to reach the top. She had been living in a dream, protected by a man who was a monster to everyone else. The man she loved was a ghost maker, and the ghost was finally standing in front of them, ready to collect her due. The silence that followed was the loudest sound Soo-yeon had ever heard. Soo-yeon felt like she was drowning in a sea of red. Her husband was a stranger. The man who kissed her forehead every morning was the same man who had watched a neighborhood burn. She looked at Jae-wook, and for the first time, she didn't see her protector. She saw a monster who had built a palace out of bones. Her hands, stained with his blood, began to shake. She pulled back, crawling away from him on the expensive rug. As she backed away, her hand brushed against the underside of the heavy mahogany side table. Her fingers hit something cold and metallic. She gasped. Taped to the bottom of the wood was a small, silver handgun. It was a backup weapon Jae-wook had hidden years ago, telling her it was only for an emergency. She gripped the handle, the metal feeling like a heavy secret in her palm. The maid, still focused on Jae-wook's face, didn't see Soo-yeon pull the weapon free. Soo-min, or whoever she really was lost in her own dark memories. She was waiting for Jae-wook to beg, but he only watched his wife with eyes that were full of sadness and a tiny bit of hope. Soo-yeon stood up slowly, her legs feeling like water. She held the gun with both hands, pointing it at the center of the room. The weight of the choice was crushing her. If she shot the maid, she would be saving a man who had murdered families to give her a life of silk. If she let the maid pull the trigger, she would be letting a daughter finally get her justice, but she would lose the only person she had ever loved. "Drop the gun," Soo-yeon whispered, her voice cracking. The maid turned her head slowly. She didn't look scared to see another weapon. She looked disappointed. "You want to save him, Soo-yeon? After everything you just heard? You want to stay in your golden cage and pretend the walls aren't covered in blood?" "I don't know what I want," Soo-yeon screamed, tears blurring her vision. "He lied to me. He's a killer. But he's my husband." Jae-wook let out a wet, rattling breath. "Soo-yeon, put it down," he gasped. He wasn't telling her to save him. He was telling her to stay innocent. He didn't want her hands to be stained with more than just his blood. He wanted her to remain the one pure thing in his dark world. The maid stepped closer to Jae-wook, ignoring the gun in Soo-yeon's shaking hands. She looked like she was ready to finish it. Soo-yeon's finger tightened on the trigger. She looked at the maid's face, which was full of 20 years of pain. Then she looked at Jae-wook's face, which was pale and full of a love that was built on lies. The room was silent, the air thick with the smell of smoke and iron. One choice would end a life, and the other would end a soul. Soo-yeon realized that no matter who she shot, the woman she used to be was already dead. The heavy silence of the penthouse was suddenly broken by a deep, low thud that shook the floor. It wasn't the sound of a gun, but the sound of the building's main power being cut. The beautiful crystal chandeliers flickered once, twice, and then went dark. The only light left came from the emergency red lamps along the baseboards, casting long, scary shadows across the room. Outside the broken window, the sound of distant sirens was replaced by the thrum of heavy engines and the screech of tires. Soo-min's head snapped toward the door. She didn't look like a vengeful ghost anymore. She looked like a soldier. She lowered her gun from Jae-wook's head and moved to the window, peering down at the street 30 floors below. Black vans were swarming the entrance, like sharks circling a wounded whale. "They are here," Soo-min whispered. Her voice was sharp and focused. "The other families. They heard the Iron Boss fell, and they've come to tear the empire apart." Soo-yeon stared at her, the silver handgun still shaking in her grip. "Isn't that what you wanted? You wanted him destroyed. I wanted him to answer to me," Soo-min hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "I didn't wait 20 years for some greedy thugs to burst in here and steal my justice with a stray bullet. If they get through those doors, they won't just kill him. They will kill you to leave no witnesses, and they will kill me for standing in their way." Suddenly, the sound of a heavy explosion echoed from the lobby far below. The building's security was completely gone. Jae-wook let out a choked cough, his hand clutching at the rug. He was losing too much blood to speak, but his eyes were fixed on the door. He knew better than anyone what happened to a mafia boss who showed weakness. Soo-min turned away from the window and kicked a heavy oak table in front of the double doors to create a barricade. She moved with a speed that was terrifying to watch. She reached into her apron again, but this time she pulled out a radio and a spare clip of bullets. She was a professional, and she knew that the hunters had now become the hunted. "Get him away from the center of the room," Soo-min commanded, pointing at Soo-yeon. "Drag him behind the kitchen island. It's reinforced steel and marble. It's the only thing in here that a bullet won't go through." Soo-yeon hesitated, looking at the woman who had just threatened to kill her husband. "Move," Sumin barked as the sound of the elevator chiming echoed from the hallway. Unless you want to die before you decide if you hate him or love him. Sooyeon dropped her weapon and grabbed Jae-wook under his arms. She pulled with every bit of strength she had, dragging his heavy, limp body across the floor. The luxury of the penthouse was gone. The romantic anniversary was a memory. Now, the room was just a battlefield, and their only hope for survival was the woman who hated them most in the world. As the first kick hit the hallway doors, Sumin raised her gun, waiting for the shadows to burst through. The sound of wood splintering filled the air as the first kick hit the heavy double doors. Sooyeon's heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest. She was huddled behind the cold marble of the kitchen island, her hands still pressed against Jae-wook's wet shirt. The smell of expensive perfume was gone, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of bleach from the cleaning closet and the thick smell of iron from her husband's blood. He's losing too much blood, Sooyeon sobbed, her voice a tiny whisper against the noise. He's going to die before they even get inside. Sumin crouched low near the barricaded door, her gun pointed at the crack in the wood. She didn't look back. Then stop crying and use your dress, she snapped. Rip the silk. Tie it tight around his chest. If he dies now, my 20 years of waiting was for nothing. I won't let him go that easily. Sooyeon looked at her beautiful navy gown. Without a second thought, she grabbed the hem and pulled with all her might. The expensive fabric tore with a loud screech. Her hands were shaking, but she remembered the first aid lessons she had taken for fun. She wrapped the long strip of silk around Jae-wook's torso, pulling it so tight he let out a sharp, pained gasp. His eyes flickered open for a second, catching hers. In that look, there was a silent thank you, but also a deep, dark sadness. Suddenly, the doors groaned and partially gave way. A flash of light from a tactical flashlight cut through the red emergency glow of the room. Sumin didn't hesitate. She fired 2 quick shots. A man's scream echoed from the hallway, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. They are in the hallway. Sumin yelled over her shoulder. We have to move him now. There is a service elevator behind the pantry. It leads to the garage. If we stay here, they will just throw a grenade and end us all. I can't lift him alone. Sooyeon cried out. Sumin cursed under her breath and ran back toward the kitchen island, keeping her head low. For a brief moment, the maid and the wife stood side by side over the man who had shaped both of their lives. One held a gun, the other held a bandage. They grabbed Jae-wook's arms together, their fingers brushing against the blood and the bleach. They moved like a single machine, fueled by a strange, desperate need to keep the Iron Boss alive. They dragged him toward the back of the kitchen, his polished shoes leaving long, dark streaks on the white tile. Bullets began to whistle through the air, shattering the expensive wine bottles on the wall behind them. Red wine poured out like more blood, mixing with a mess on the floor. Almost there, Sumin grunted, her face tight with effort. They reached the small, hidden door of the service elevator just as the main barricade finally broke. The penthouse was being swarmed by men in dark masks. Sumin shoved the couple into the small metal box and stepped in after them, hitting the button for the basement. As the door slid shut, the last thing Sooyeon saw was the ruined remains of her perfect life. She was trapped in a small, dark space with a husband who was a killer and a maid who was a ghost. The service elevator rattled as it moved slowly toward the basement. The small space was dim, lit only by a flickering yellow light. Jae-wook sat slumped against the metal wall, his face the color of dry bone. Every time the elevator shook, he winced in pain. Sooyeon sat beside him, her navy dress ruined and soaked with red. She looked at Sumin, who stood by the control panel, her eyes fixed on the floor numbers. You said he killed your family, Sooyeon said, her voice small in the quiet lift. Tell me the rest. If we are going to die together, I want to know the whole truth. Sumin did not look up, but her jaw tightened. My father was the foreman at the docks. He wasn't a gangster. He was a man who made sure the workers were paid fairly. When Jae-wook wanted to use the docks for his illegal shipments, my father said no. He told Jae-wook that he would not let blood money touch his workers' hands. She finally looked at Jae-wook, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. Jae-wook didn't just kill him. He waited until my mother and I were inside our small house. He locked the doors from the outside. He wanted to make sure the message was clear to everyone else. If you say no to the Iron Dragon, your whole world burns. I only survived because my mother pushed me through a tiny crawl space in the floor before the roof fell. Jae-wook let out a ragged breath. He looked up at Sumin, and for the first time, he didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who was ready to pay a debt. The elevator chimed as it reached the garage. The door slid open to reveal the sound of tires screeching and men shouting nearby. The rival families were already waiting. "They are at the main gate," Sumin whispered, checking her gun. "We won't make it to the car." Jae-wook reached out and grabbed Sumin's hand. His grip was weak, but his eyes were steady. "Leave me," he gasped. "There is a small door behind the trash bins. It leads to the subway tunnel. If you go now, they won't see you. They only want me." Soo-yeon shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, Jae-wook. I won't leave you. Listen to me," Jae-wook said, looking at his wife. "I have lived a life of sin. I have taken everything from people like her. If I stay here and draw them away, you can get out. Sumin can take you." He turned his gaze to the maid. "You wanted your justice. You wanted me dead. Here is your chance. Take her to safety, and I will stay here and face them. My life for hers. That is the only payment I have left." Sumin froze. She had spent 20 years wanting to see him die, but she had never imagined him offering his life to save someone else. She looked at the crying wife, then at the dying man. Her hand shook on her weapon. She had to decide if her revenge was more important than saving a woman who was innocent of her husband's crimes. The sounds of heavy footsteps were getting closer, and the time for secrets was over. The sun began to rise over Seoul, painting the city in shades of soft pink and gold. Inside the penthouse, the air was cold and smelled of smoke. The red emergency lights had finally flickered out, replaced by the natural light of a new day. Han Jae-wook sat alone on the floor of his ruined living room. He was leaning against the sofa, his chest wrapped in the blood-stained navy silk of his wife's dress. He had survived the night, but the cost had been everything he owned. The rival gangs had retreated when the police sirens finally grew loud in the streets below. Jae-wook looked around at the broken glass and the overturned furniture. The gold-trimmed mirrors were shattered, and the expensive paintings were torn. The Iron Throne he had built with so much violence was now just a pile of junk in a silent room. He was alive, but he felt like a ghost in his own home. He looked toward the door where Sumin had stood just hours ago. The maid was gone. She had taken Soo-yeon through the secret tunnels, fulfilling the final deal they had made in the garage. She hadn't pulled the trigger on him, but she had done something much more painful. She had taken the only person who made his life feel real. Sumin had disappeared back into the shadows of the city, her 20-year hunger for justice finally satisfied by leaving him with nothing but his memories. A soft sound at the entrance made Jae-wook look up. Soo-yeon stood there, framed by the morning light. She wasn't wearing her silk gown anymore. She wore a simple coat and carried a small bag. Her face was pale, and her eyes were clear. She didn't look like a mafia wife. She looked like a woman who had finally woken up from a long, dark dream. "I came to say goodbye," she said. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks. "I did it all for you," Jae-wook whispered, his voice cracking. "I wanted you to have everything." "You gave me everything except the truth," Soo-yeon replied. She looked at the blood on the floor, and then at the man she once thought was a hero. "I can't live in a house built on graves, Jae-wook. The diamonds don't shine when I know where the money came from. I am leaving the city. I am leaving the name Han behind." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing on the hard wood. She didn't look back. She walked out of the penthouse and into the bright morning, finally free from the Mafia's heavy shadow. Jae-wook watched her go until the door clicked shut. He sat in the silence of his empty palace, the king of a kingdom that no longer existed. The sun was high in the sky now, but for Han Jae-wook, the world had never felt darker.